Okay, hello and welcome to Cinema 104, History of Motion Pictures, 1945 to present. And if you are in the full 16-week class, this would be class 2 or week 2. But if this is the Saturday 8-week class, then this would be the class we would have right after lunch. So I'm just going to call it class 2. I hope it doesn't confuse you in the Saturday class. And I'd like to note, especially to the Saturday class, that we won't be going all day without looking at films and film clips and things like that. The first lecture is kind of PowerPoint heavy, lots and lots of stuff to cover the first 50 years or so of motion picture history. But from here on out, what I would be doing in the classroom would be talking a little bit and then turning out the lights and looking at a clip for 10 or 15 minutes and then talking for a little bit more and putting more PowerPoint slides up and then turning out the lights. I hope it's a well-paced class. And so the pacing for you, you're sort of on your own. Of course, since this is a YouTube video, you can start and stop it anytime you want. And that's great. I would say if you pause the video and then as long as you're there on YouTube, maybe look around for some of the films. And I will send you a list in an email, and later on I expect to have the list on Canvas for you as well. But you will get a list of URLs and they will link you to clips of the films that we're talking about, whether it's a documentary on film noir, bringing darkness to light, or some clips from Double Indemnity, or Sunset Boulevard, or Some Like It Hot, or Singin' in the Rain, or something like that. And these clips won't be exactly the clips I would be showing in class. They're pretty close, but they won't be exactly the clips that I'd be showing in class. And since I have pretty much the entire class on DVDs, I would bring my all my DVDs in, and then I can start and stop it wherever I basically. But with the pre-chosen clip tube, I don't get to do that. But I hope you will enjoy the clips, but I also hope you will explore. And if you see something that you're kind of into, like film noir, or possibly Marilyn Monroe, or who knows what, or James Dean, then you should be doing some more exploring on your own, right? You know how YouTube works. Just type in the film or the actor, something like that, and do some exploring on your own. And that's the best way to make the class much more enjoyable, I think, is to watch lots and lots of clips of movies and things like that. Okay, so let's dive into today. And today we're going to start with film noir. Film noir is just a French term for dark cinema. It came out of some novels. Série noir came out of some novels, and in novels, a lot of times people are writing in the first person. We talked about the first person versus third person in an earlier class, and a number of these movies are based on books that were written in the first person, so they're going to replicate that in the film by having voiceover narration. Okay, so we get some nice tropes. We've talked about tropes already with musicals and with westerns and things like that. So in film noir, we get moral ambiguity, right? Who's the good guy and who's the bad guy? And are the good guys really good? And are the bad guys really bad? And so on. We're also going to get voiceover, like I said, which replicates writing in the first person if it were a book. We get femme fatales, the fatal woman. And, you know, that's kind of cool because a lot of actors like to play the bad guy. I mean, that's really a good part to play for actors and actresses. And in horror movies of the 30s and 40s, a lot of times women have to get rescued, right, from the monster, from Frankenstein or Dracula or something like that. But in film noir, they are kind of in charge, and they're the smart ones. And a lot of times the guys are way behind the women. The women are way ahead in terms of planning. Now, they're not always good. They're not always good. Sometimes they're fatal, right? But basically, it's a good genre for women. They tend to do really well and have lots of lines and lots of the plot and all that. Also, we get cigarettes for sure. It's the 40s, lots of cigarettes and cigarette smoke. And as bad as cigarette smoke is for our lungs, we all know that, it looks really cool photographically. Okay, so at some point somebody's going to have to figure out a totally non-lethal, non-toxic way to smoke, because smoke looks kind of cool, but of course it ruins our lungs. So anyway, they didn't know all about that back in the 30s and 40s. Neon, a lot of this takes place in cities, a little bit claustrophobic and so on, things closing in, usually violence and crime, but importantly, not gangsters. So not The Godfather or Scarface or Goodfellas. Those are not noir movies. Those are gangster movies. It's a whole kind of different genre, even though they're both crime related. And they are often, but not always, B movies, meaning that they don't always have the biggest stars, and they don't always have the biggest budgets. And matter of fact, all of this dark lighting is actually helpful on a low budget movie. You don't have to make as many sets and things like that. It actually kind of helps out with low budget type movies. And lots of shadows, very evocative, wonderful black and white photography. This is definitely one of the genres, along with horror, that I really would not want to see in color. It's just gorgeous in black and white. It really is. And this picture kind of shows it. It's really wonderful stuff in black and white. But sometimes they are A movies, right? Sometimes they're with big stars and big directors and all that. A couple that we're going to see today are actually from big directors and things. Billy Wilder, but often they're B movies. And over the years, we have sort of gotten a newfound respect for these wonderful noir films. So right about here is where I would show the documentary Bringing Darkness to Light. I think the entire documentary is on YouTube. I usually show about the first 10 or 12 minutes of the documentary. So this would be a good time, really, if you want to pause and then type in Bringing Darkness to Light or Film Noir Bringing Darkness to Light, and that'll bring up, luckily, the entire video. So if you're into it, you can watch the entire 80 or 90 minute thing on Film Noir documentary. It's quite good. And if not, then I would be showing in class about the first 15 minutes or so of the documentary Bringing Darkness to Light. Then, after that, I would switch over to Double Indemnity, which is from one of our prime directors. And I think I told you already that this class is very director-centric and very auteur-driven. Billy Wilder is probably our first director of the semester, and he came to the U.S. escaping Europe and the Nazis in the 30s. English wasn't his first language, but his scripts are so amazing. What he does with dialogue, you just hardly can believe the wonderful verbal interplay that they have. And in the scene, I would be showing the very beginning of the film, and we're going to see our protagonist here, who he's only got one thing on his mind, really, her, and getting her in the sack, as they say. And she's way ahead of him. She's like 10 steps ahead. He's playing checkers, and she's playing, I don't know, three-dimensional chess. She's way ahead of him, and she's definitely a femme fatale. Definitely a femme fatale. Really, really evil. But it's a great, juicy part for Barbara Stanwyck there, and that's Fred Astaire on the left. And they're going to have this, in this scene, if you watch it, they're going to have this wonderful conversation, and it's full of lots of innuendo. he is selling car insurance. So they're going to have this conversation about how fast was I going, officer, and things like that. Suppose you get down off your motorcycle. So they're going to have this conversation sort of relating to cars since he's selling car insurance. But of course, they're talking about other stuff. And we're going to get voiceover for sure. And he's going to have a great line. I don't know if you're going to see it or not. How could I know that death could smell like, oh, and he names a flower, and I'm trying to remember the name of the flower. I don't know, eccamellias or something. But anyway, we're going to have a framing device. Okay, so at the very beginning of the film, there's a taxi cab racing through the streets of LA, and he gets out and he goes into a building where he works, an insurance building, and rides up the elevator and goes in, and he's got a little spot. It's not very big, but he's got a spot in his on his chest there, and that's where he's been shot. That's where he's been shot. So he won't be using his left hand throughout all that. And he's going to light a cigarette, of course. He's going to light a cigarette. It's all nice and dark and moody. And then he's going to start doing voiceover into a recording device in the office. It's an early dictation sort of a machine, and that's where we're going to get him telling the story in voiceover. So that's going to frame the story. We know that he's been shot. Now, who shot him and how he got shot and all that, that's kind of the mystery that's going to have to get solved. Okay, well, we can kind of guess that likely she shot him, but we still don't know. We still don't know her fate or anything like that. A little bit of a spoiler alert. I will tell you that since this is in the 1940s, that the Hayes Code, it was named after Will Hayes, that ran it, and it was put up by the studios, so it was self-censorship. They wouldn't allow for anybody to get away with murder. Okay, now today you can have the sort of things where the bad guy gets away with it or something like that, and then some of the remakes in the 80s and 90s and so on, yeah, people can actually get away with murder. But no, he's not going to get away, and she's not going to get away, because that's the way the code was back then. But it's still a great movie to find out how they come together and then eventually fall apart. Right? This whole plan is going to fall apart. And double indemnity is like an insurance policy. It pays double if the policyholder dies at work, I think it is. And I think when they go to kill her husband, he's traveling to a work-related event. I think that's it. I can't remember exactly, but anyway, it's an insurance policy term, double indemnity, and so his policy is maybe going to pay double. Okay, and really classic, all-time film noir, wonderful movie. All right, and if you get a chance, then track down Body Heat from 1981. Certainly, it's R-rated. You could probably tell from that. And so nudity and language and all that, and possibly even getting away with the crime. I don't want to give too much away. It's a fantastic movie, but it's definitely neo-noir. Regular film noir would be the 40s and 50s. This is definitely neo-noir, new noir. And it has a wonderful opening, and they are sort of talking a little raunchier than they did in the 1940s, but they're going to be talking in that sort of double entendre way, talking about one thing but meaning something else. So I would show about the first 5 minutes of that film next. It's really wonderful. Then we would go back to Billy Wilder and Sunset Boulevard from 1950. And this one also has a framing device. And we're going to hear this guy right here, this poor writer. He's going to say, when he describes who got killed, just a writer with a couple of B pictures to his credit. And he's going to be referring to himself. So at the beginning, it's interesting. He's going to start talking about that the police raced to the home of a silent movie star, and they found this guy. floating in the pool. One shot in his, 2 shots in his back, 1 shot in his stomach, something like that. Floating face down in the swimming pool. They got that shot by putting a mirror on the bottom of the pool, apparently. I guess they didn't have underwater cameras back then. And it is a silent movie star from the 1930s, Norma Desmond, and so many classic lines. I'm ready for my close-up. Mr. DeMille is in this film, and the actual Cecil DeMille, who was a big-time director back in the 30s and 40s and 50s, and so on, is in this. And the Hays office wasn't crazy about the original opening for the film. And the original opening for the film, it apparently was going to take place at a morgue, and I guess the attendant was going to leave, and then the bodies would sit up, I guess, on the slabs or something like that, and start talking. How did you die? Oh, my girlfriend's husband shot me, or something like that, or car accident. And then this guy was going to say, well, have you ever heard of, you know, Norma Desmond, the famous movie star? And then he tells his story from the beyond, basically. And I guess they thought that was a little too gruesome. So I don't know how this is less gruesome than a morgue, but I guess it is. And he's at a swimming pool, and then we would see that he was a B picture writer. He has the repo men on his tail, and he gets a flat tire while he's fleeing them and pulls into her large, rather large, but really run down, at least the grounds are, estate. The swimming pool's empty, and nothing's been watered or anything like that. And then he meets her, and they have a wonderful conversation. It's a great scene. That's a good one to watch. And we're going to see that Norma's a little bit delusional and all of that. And he's going to sort of get pulled in to her web. And she has a butler, manservant, sort of taking care of her. And they are expecting someone else. And it's a great scene. And then she's going to find out he's a writer and tell him that she's got a script that's ready, and she's going to send it to Mr. DeMille and all of that. And we're going to find out. And we're going to get to see some old-time movie stars. Buster Keaton has a very small role playing cards with Norma in her card group. And our poor writer here, William Holden, he is sort of like her boy toy, right? She buys him expensive clothes and jewelry and things like that. And of course, he doesn't really like the idea of being emasculated, but he's going to sort of go along with it for a little while. Okay, wonderful film, one of the all-time great classics, Sunset Boulevard. And then my last film with Billy Wilder would be with Marilyn Monroe, Some Like It Hot, 1959. And this had trouble with the Hays Code, partly because our two male protagonists are escaping the mob. Okay, they're escaping the mob. They have accidentally witnessed a gangland massacre. So this movie is set in 1927. I think it's 27 or 29. And so that's during Prohibition. So that's the gangsters and bootleg alcohol and all that good kind of stuff. And these guys are musicians. And after the club is raided, where they're performing, they are looking for work. And the only work they can find is in an all-female orchestra or band. And then they accidentally witness the real life. There really was, in 1927, a massacre on February 14th. So heretofore known as the St. Valentine's Day Massacre. So they're going to have sort of their own version of the St. Valentine's Day Massacre. They're going to witness it, flee the mob, get in drag, as it's known, and get on a train for Florida. And so they are in Chicago, and they're going to get in the train, and they're going to play Daphne and Geraldine, I think it is, or Josephine. I guess it's Joe and Jerry. So Josephine and Geraldine, but Geraldine uh, doesn't like it, so she's going to be Daphne. Anyway, hilarious movie. And your first chance to see Marilyn Monroe. There she is, really at her peak. It is probably her very best film. And there's a wonderful scene with some jokes that you might not get. And so I'll explain that when they first meet her on the train, she's going to say, I come from, my name is Sugar Kowalczyk, and she changed it to Sugar Cain. I come from this musical family, she's going to say. My mother was a piano teacher and my father was a conductor. And they'll ask, oh, where did he conduct? And she'll say, on the Baltimore and Ohio. Well, the Baltimore and Ohio is a train, a train system. So he's a train conductor, not a musical conductor. Anyway, that's the joke. And now you'll get it. And some wonderful lines of dialogue that when they see her, look at the way she moves. It's like Jello on springs. Wonderful, wonderful dialogue like that. It's really a great movie, and one of the all-time classic endings of movies. Really, it's a great ending. So look at some clips for that. Maybe you can find some of those. I think I've got some links to some of those scenes, and then maybe explore. Right, great stuff. And so the movie was. It takes place in Florida, but standing in for Florida is the Hotel del Coronado, and that's in San Diego. Okay, so there we go. Set in Prohibition era, 1929 Chicago, St. Valentine's Day Massacre, and some real life actors who played in the gangster movies back in the 1930s. Okay, so George Raft, who was in Scarface, and he's going to play Spats Colombo. And if you don't know, spats are this sort of covering that go over your shoelaces, sort of formal wear. You might see them in wedding attire. That's about the only formal wear that most people know these days, is getting dressed up for a wedding if you're in a wedding. But anyway, Spats Colombo. George Raft was in Scarface. Pat O'Brien often played cops, Irish cops. Pat O'Brien, and Joan Blondell is Sweet Sue, and she was in tons and tons, not just of gangster movies, but of musicals that were done back in the 1930s as well. So for a 1959 audience, it would be a real thrill to see some of your favorite movie stars from 25 years ago back in the movies. They're not the leads, of course. Tony Curtis and Jack Lemmon are, but still, it's fun to see them in smaller roles. And here we're going to see Tony Curtis, and he steals that nice sort of yachting outfit, and he's going to tell Marilyn Monroe, "See that yacht parked out there? That's mine." Okay, so she's going to believe him. And so on, and he's going to be doing this odd accent. You might not pick up the accent. It's sort of this odd accent. But basically, he's doing his version of Cary Grant. And Cary Grant was a big, big movie star in the 30s and 40s and 50s. He was in a number of Alfred Hitchcock movies and some great stuff. And that odd accent that he's doing, I can't do it, but that odd-ish accent that he's doing is Cary Grant. And Cary Grant was alive in 1959, and he loved it. He thought it was just hilarious. So anyway, Jack Lemmon there on the left, and Tony Curtis and Marilyn Monroe at the Hotel del Coronado. Here's a more recent picture of the Hotel del Coronado in San Diego. Beautiful place. If you go to see it, you can go into the lobby. They have pictures of the film, framed all through the lobby and things like that. And certainly good for extra credit, but I wouldn't ask you to go to San Diego for extra credit. But if you find yourself in San Diego before the semester's over, sure, take a couple of pictures and write it up for an extra credit paper. Okay, so Billy Wilder. Next up, we would be moving on to musicals, and Singin' in the Rain from 1952. Mostly, this is the one that tops the lists as the best musical ever, ever, ever of all time. Singin' in the Rain. There are a lot of great ones, American in Paris and so on, but this has got Gene Kelly, one of the top M.G.M people. They put lots of money into it. The sets are nice. It's in color for 1952, and it took color a little while to really hit 100%. And I showed you that color graph, or that color chart. Even though it was developed in the early to mid 1930s, it wasn't until about 35 years later, in the late 1960s, that virtually 100% of American movies were in color. And I always contrast that with sound. And sound went from 1927, when it first came in, to about 1930, just 3 years later. Virtually all American movies were sync sound talkies, as they were called. So 3 years for talkies and 35 years for color. Anyway, M.G.M, they loved using color in their musicals especially, and Gene Kelly would direct or co-direct and help choreograph and all that. And that wonderful Singin' in the Rain number that he does, he was sick at the time. He had a temperature of, I don't know, 102 or 103, something like that, but he toughed it out. He knew people were waiting for him. And this is the movie that a little bit of research, I ask you in your papers to do a little bit of research, and you'll, if this is one of the movies you'll watch, you'll see research about how he was sick, and maybe that they had to put, I think, some kind of milk with the water so that it would show up on camera, right? Otherwise, it's a little hard to see water. You have to light it kind of from behind so it will show up. Plus, they have to light him from the front. And anyway, they're having a little bit of trouble. So it's a sort of a milky, sort of a liquid on a classic Hollywood soundstage at M.G.M Studios in Culver City. And great example of a studio film, big studio film. And even though only Gene is in front of the camera, there's probably dozens and dozens of people behind the camera with lights and microphones and the cameras and all sorts of stuff, and they have to play the music back so he knows what to sing to, and actually he would be lip syncing to himself, and so on. Anyway, a great example of a big studio film, Singin' in the Rain. And so it takes place at the beginning of the sound era, right about the same time that Some Like It Hot takes place. So that's kind of interesting. One from 1952, one from 1959. And, you know, Hollywood struggling to get into the sound era is a big part of the film. It really is an all-time classic. It's a comedy, musical comedy. And the leading lady in the 1927 era that Gene Kelly's in, she doesn't have a very good voice for sound. And so they're trying to figure out how they can get Lena in the movies, and they figure out a way of kind of lip syncing and so on. So watch a couple of scenes from Singin' in the Rain, including the main song. That's an easy one to find. And then after that, there is a modern movie from 2017, Hail Caesar, from the Coen Brothers. I love the Coen Brothers, and we'll be talking about the Coen Brothers later in the class. There's Scarlett Johansson. And just for extra credit, but check out Hail Caesar because it is set at a studio very much like M.G.M in the early 1950s. And so that's going to give the Coen Brothers a chance to poke fun at actually underwater musicals, cowboy movies, singing cowboy movies, which were kind of a big thing, singing cowboy movies, historical epic type movies. There were lots of movies made in the 1950s that took place like a couple thousand years ago. They called them sword and sandal movies. Some were about the life of Christ, and some were with chariot racing and pyramids and all sorts of stuff. And for some reason, that was kind of a big thing. In the 1950s, they were big and they were widescreen and they had intermissions and all that. And so the Coen brothers get a chance to sort of poke fun at all of this and the communist witch hunts and all that kind of stuff. So what I always would show just the trailer of Hail Caesar. And so make sure you watch the trailer for Hail Caesar. It really is a fun movie and for extra credit. So sticking with genres from musical, then I would move on to Westerns. And really the top Western of all time too, kind of lucky that they're in the 1950s, would be The Searchers. On many lists, The Searchers would be at the top. There's our director, John Ford. Below, he won 4 Oscars for directing, which is the record. And there he is in Monument Valley. I believe that's in Utah. The film says it's set in Arizona, but I think this is in Utah. Beautiful stuff. The movie's in color, which was a little unusual for Westerns in the 1950s, but the movie was in color. And we get our star, John Wayne. Classic, iconic Western star, John Wayne. Our airport, John Wayne Airport, down in Santa Ana, Costa Mesa there, is John Wayne Airport. It was named after him partly because he had a house on the Newport Peninsula and had a yacht and all that. And so yeah, John Wayne, part of Orange County. And John Ford. And this is a scene from the film, and we're going to get some wonderful tropes, shootouts. We're not going to get all of this, right? We're not going to get all this. We're not going to get the saloons and stuff. We're going to get kind of a posse. There's definitely an Indian attack. There's Monument Valley, gorgeous Monument Valley. It really is something. And John Ford liked to shoot in Monument Valley. And so this movie was, like you see, really gorgeous and in color and a real classic Western. Let's see what's next. So, in the Untamed West, women are kind of equaling or symbolizing, would be a better word, civilization after prospectors and trappers and so on, and quite likely prostitutes, frankly, would possibly be next. But when women start coming out, then you're going to start having homes and schools and churches and civilization, right? You're really going to have civilization with and families and children, right? All that is going to happen. And kind of conversely, Europe really loves our Wild West. And back in the 1870s and 1880s, Europeans would come out to America sort of like tourists and get all duded up in Western gear and get a nice gun, and you could ride across the West on trains. The Transcontinental Railroad was finished in 1869, something like that. Anyway, you could shoot buffalo from the back of the train. As ugly as that sounds, right? They would just shoot them. They wouldn't, they wouldn't even get them for their meat or their hides or anything. They just, oh, look at that. I got me a buffalo, right? But Americans too, not just Europeans. But our hugeness, right? All that, you travel for days and days and days, and you're not even across the continent. And Europe is much more compact and much smaller than that. The Aboriginal peoples of Europe were long gone by then, and we still had, Native Americans. And that was very fascinating. That was fascinating to Europeans, and these canyons and valleys and mountains and all that. I mean, Europe, they've got the Alps and stuff, but it's not nearly so big. You can't just get on a train and travel for 3 or 4 days and still not reach the end. But for us, we really love, royalty and kings and queens and knights and castles and fairy tales and all of that. It's kind of what you don't have, you kind of they kind of like or want. And we're big on all that kind of stuff. Sleeping Beauty Castle at Disneyland and all those fairy tales and so on. So it's kind of a mutual admiration society. And so back to this women and civilization, I mention that in part because the crux of the story is there is an Indian attack, and they are going to, and it's based on a real attack, by the way, that happened in the 1830s or 1840s. Some young white girls, as they would have been called, were kidnapped and taken, and our hero, the John Wayne character, he is thinking that he's probably going to have to do an honor killing. Okay, so the idea of being taken by this savage race, as they would have been called, right? They would have been called by some people back then, as ugly as that sounds. That when he finds her, being taken as the squaw of an Indian, Native American, that's a fate worse than death. You're better off dead, right, than being a Indian wife. That's the thought. That's the thought. That's not my thought. That's the thought that is surrounding this film, and that he would be part of. And kind of racist, really. Yeah, kind of, just really racist. So it's kind of unusual to see that in this film from the hero, and the idea is that he would be, he's the hero. He's John Wayne. He's a big hero, and he's going to find the girl, and years are going to go by. When she is abducted, she's, I don't know, 9 or something, or 8, and as the years go by, he knows she would have reached womanhood and probably taken as a wife, and so on, and he vows when he finds her to kill her. So it's really complicated. It's really complicated. He's not going to. Spoiler alert, he's not going to. But he's definitely got a real racist streak running through him. Luckily, the guy that he's riding around with is not like that, and he will be the hero by the end of the movie. But it's definitely complicated stuff. That's for sure. Okay, so we're gonna switch now. You might want to take a break, but we're gonna switch now and talk about the fall of the studio system. And I wanted to tell you about the studio system in the first class, because basically when the class begins, 1945, we very shortly get the fall of the studio system. So I wanted you to know what was falling. Okay, what's falling is, with the actors under long-term contracts and vertical integration and all that sort of thing. And so independent theater owners were not particularly happy with the kinds of deals that they were getting from the studios. They had to buy blocks of movies, or rent blocks of movies, and they didn't even get a chance to see the movies before they were told they had to rent them, choose them. And so they took the studios to court, block booking and blind bidding, that was called. And they took the studios to court, and it reached the Supreme Court right there. That's the Supreme Court building in Washington, D.C. And the court ruled with the plaintiffs. And they said the studios can't be doing vertical integration anymore, and you're going to have to sell off their theater chains. So that's the very first part of the fall of the studio system. Okay. The second part is that the studio lots are not going to be used so much. And that's valuable land. And when they bought that land in the 19-teens and the 1920s, it was kind of outside of town, right? Downtown LA, and Hollywood's 10 or 12 miles outside of downtown LA, orange groves and things like that. And now these studios are going to be more in the middle of the city, and taxes are going to be higher and that sort of thing. And there's going to be more and more filming on location instead of filming in Hollywood's version of New York or London or Paris. Some directors are going to say, I want to go to the real thing, at least for part of the movie, the outdoor parts. Cameras get a little smaller, They don't need 3 strips of film in order to do color, and so on. So it's like a factory that's not being used, right? Just the night watchman's going through and making sure that the Ford plant or the Apple plant or you name it is okay and is safe because they're off somewhere else or it's not being used. Normally with a factory, you want it to be humming along. And if it's a really popular product, you might even run 3 shifts, 24 hours a day, cranking out those iPhones or cranking out those Fords or something like that. I think this is universal, I'm not sure. And it's more recent. I can't tell these cars. They look like taxis. Yellow, they look like they would be taxis. And I can't tell when this was taken, but it's a nice example of a what they call a backlot. And notice that the roads don't go straight. And the reason for that is because if it just went straight, then you'd know that there were trees or mountains or something like that. So the way they would build these, it would be lots of sort of curves and stuff, even the cities and stuff, so that you would never look off the set. And the next part of the fall of the studio system, the 4 parts, actors are getting out of their long-term contracts, 5- and 7-year contracts. This is the biggest actor and the biggest studio head of the 1930s and 1940s. That's Clark Gable, and that's Louis B. Mayer, and I suspect that's David O. Selznick. This might have something to do with Gone with the Wind. Anyway, instead of a 5- or 7-year contract, in the 1950s, the income tax rate was actually quite a bit higher than it is today, and it requires a little bit of explaining. When you hear some candidates running for office talking about a 40 or 50 or 60% tax rate, basically there are tiers. So if you make up to $50,000 or $60,000, then you're taxed at one rate, and if you make up to $100,000, then from 50 to 100 is taxed at a different rate. And then if you make over $250,000 or something like that, then anything above $250,000 is taxed at the 3rd rate. So all of your money isn't taxed at that high rate. The first chunk of your money is taxed at the low rate, where most of us are, at least I am. The second part of your money, and I don't know where the tables, I don't know how high it goes, but probably over 100,000 or something like that would be taxed at a second rate. And then some people are saying, well, after you make $1 million or $2 million, then anything you make over $2 million should be taxed at a higher rate. So all of your money wouldn't be taxed at 70%, but the money that you make from 1 million on up or 2 million on up would be taxed at that higher rate. Anyway, just wanted to clear that up. A lot of people are confused about that. So actors back in the 1950s were taxed at a pretty high rate, 90%. 90% of the money that they made over a couple $1 million when you adjust for inflation. So they started getting agents and lawyers, and they started becoming heads of their own corporations so that they could pay themselves. If they had a real big contract, they started working out deals where they would be paid for their movie over a period of 4 or 5 years. So, wealthy people usually are going to find good help with accountants and lawyers and things like that, so that they don't pay the full amount of whatever it was. But it was 90% back in 1950 because of World War II and raising all that money for planes and tanks and jeeps and everything. So actors start getting agents. They start getting them a percent of the film. Okay, so it began in 1950. Jimmy Stewart was a big actor of that era, and a studio wanted him to, or an independent producer wanted him to make a film. His asking price was too high, and they said, well, we can't afford that. And his agent said, well, if you can give Mr. Stewart a percent of the profits, then he will take a much smaller upfront fee, okay, upfront fee. And if the movie tanks, then tough luck for Mr. Stewart. But if the movie's a big hit, then Mr. Stewart will make lots more money. And the same thing that would happen maybe for Clark Gable, or certainly today for Leonardo DiCaprio or Brad Pitt or somebody like that, or Sandra Bullock. People would be getting, Johnny Depp has made hundreds of millions of dollars in profit sharing from the Pirates of the Caribbean movies. So that began back in the early 1950s. Okay, and this is part of the fall of the studio system. These profit sharing, back end deals, and so on. So now the studios they're not just treating them like children, like you do what we tell you to do. They are they're talk to my agent. So that's the third nail in the coffin of the fall of the studio system. This takes a while. It doesn't happen in a year or two. It probably takes 12 or 15 years or so, but it starts. And then the final nail, really the final nail in the coffin, is television. And at the beginning, the studios ignored television. Later on, they fought it. And then finally, after about 10 years or so, they embraced it. And that's really, it's really short-sighted. They seemed to do okay with radio. When radio became a big hit in the 1930s, they sort of embraced radio, and they took radio stars and put them in their movies, and really sort of swallowed it up. And you wonder why were they so short-sighted with television? But they told their big stars, Marilyn Monroe or Clark Gable or Jimmy Stewart, don't go on TV, right? You're a big star. You're a star of the big screen, the silver screen. Don't go on that little 21-inch black and white thing, right? So first they ignored it, 48, 49, 50, 51. Then it started catching on. I Love Lucy was a big hit, things like that. So then they fought it, and they told their actors to stay away from it. And it wasn't really until maybe 1958 or 1959 when they started really getting involved in producing television programs. They had cameras and so on, and lights and all that. Television really grew out of radio. It really grew out of radio. The three television networks, NBC, CBS, and ABC, were originally radio networks. NBC, CBS, and ABC. They were radio networks, and then they became TV networks. Now today, of course, they're all together, and Disney and Paramount and CBS and all that. They're all together in giant conglomerates. But back then, they were fighting it out, and really kind of short-sighted. Why not think about using TV to promote your latest movie? But they just weren't thinking that way, right? They just weren't thinking that way. So right here, I would show a documentary about widescreen movies, and you have the link to it. So the whole thing's online. It's about, 7 or 8 minutes. And they're going to talk about pan and scan. Now today, pan and scan isn't such a big deal because most of our flat screen TVs are wider than those more square-ish television sets. And if you're just looking at this slide here, the slide is fairly square-ish, right? It's a little bit wider than it is high. It's about 1.3. But when these wide movies started coming out, you're either going to see a lot of black at the top and the bottom of the movie, or you're going to see like the middle part of the film. Or the camera's going to shoot over here, and then it's going to pan over here, back and forth. That's pan and scan. So that's all going to get explained in that wonderful documentary from Turner Classic Movies. So right here, that's where you would watch that documentary. And I put Forbidden Planet up because when in class, I recorded it off air, and it came after Forbidden Planet. And Forbidden Planet is such a cool movie. Usually I talk about Forbidden Planet for a little while, so I would watch the trailer for Forbidden Planet. I think I have the link for that. Very influential for Gene Roddenberry and Star Trek, and very influential for George Lucas and Star Wars. It's an interplanetary crew, much like Star Trek. And then there are scenes that you will see that look like every Star Wars scene where the Jedi Knights battle have a lightsaber battle. One of those giant, huge, like you can't even see the bottom of the power generating thing, Death Star station, something like that. And there's a scene in this film, somewhere in the middle of this film, that's just like that. And so I would check around for some scenes in Forbidden Planet. It's very cool. The other thing that's cool about Forbidden Planet, for the 1950s, it was in color. It was big budget, and most sci-fi movies of the 1950s weren't in color and weren't big budget, and they weren't widescreen. And it's also actually based on a Shakespeare play called The Tempest. And in The Tempest, a sailing ship lands on an island, and of course here in the movie, a spaceship lands on a planet. And the planet has been long abandoned by a far superior race of unseen space aliens, which sounds exactly like a Star Trek plot. I think they borrowed the whole plot for it. I don't know. Anyway, Forbidden Planet, very cool movie if you're into sci-fi. Robots. Some of the effects were done by people at the Disney company. Animated the monster and some of that stuff are sort of animated. So it's a very, very cool movie. But at the end of the movie, there's the Turner Classic Movies mini doc on letterboxing. And so on the way to the letterboxing doc, I usually stop for a detour on Forbidden Planet. And just the way aspect ratios work, this is the way television and old movies before 1950 would be, right? It's called aspect ratio, and it's about 1 unit by 1 1/3 units, right? So it's about 1.3 by 1, okay? Or 4 by 3 would be the other way of putting it. Most movies today are, well, first off, our flat screen TVs are like this, and our computer screens are like this. Slightly wider are most movies, the vast majority of movies, U.S. theatrical showings since the 1950s, 1.85 by 1. But there are also widescreen movies, and there are still widescreen movies today that are 2.39, almost 2.4 times as wide. So we take 1 unit, 2 units, and 40% of a 1/3 unit, okay? So no matter how big it is, it's 2.39 by 1, right? So there's the 1, and there's the 2.39. Okay, don't worry about all these numbers. I'm not going to ask this stuff on tests or anything, but I just want you to know why there's letterboxing and why, movies seem to be of different sizes. Some of the early movies, like maybe Sunset Boulevard and some of that stuff that we watch in this class, are going to be of the square aspect ratio, certainly. Double Indemnity is going to be of the older aspect ratio. And then by the end of the semester, we'll be watching movies that are widescreen. Okay, so again, don't worry about all the numbers. Don't worry about all the numbers. I just want to put that up for comparison's sake. So there is an unintended consequence of all this, and that is the rise of drive-ins. And so in the post-war baby boom, there are lots of babies that are being born that weren't born during the Great Depression of the 30s or during the war years of the 40s. So sort of pent up, people wanting to start families, not being able to start families really because of economic uncertainty or certainly war, pretty uncertain times. And then when all the men and women come back from Europe and come back from the Pacific and start having all of the children that might have been born in the late 30s, certainly in the 30s and in the warriors of the 40s. And so that spike in population growth from 1946 to 1960 or so, those 15 years, are known as the baby boom, right? And now all the boomers, okay, boomers, all the boomers are reaching retirement, but you know, they were kind of the big thing there for the longest time because there's so many of them, and of course that's where the money is with the big crowd. So working its way through the 1960s and the anti-war and the Vietnam era and all that, those are the boomers, right? Sort of running things for the longest time. And interestingly, around 1960, almost a third of all screens in the U.S. are outdoors. Okay, drive-in screens, almost a third. So that's really something. That's an awful lot. And so if you have a family, first off, a lot of the big movie theaters are downtown, just like the Chinese theaters, they're downtown. And if you've got little infants and things like that, and maybe they're crying or squirmy or who knows what, right? It's tough for a parent to take, you know, infants to the movies. But if you go in your car, then they can cry and squirm and do all of that, and it's not so bad. And in a number of drive-ins, right down here, they would put playgrounds, like mini playgrounds, swing sets and teeter-totters and so on, and the parents could sort of watch their kids and watch the movie until the kids get tired, and then they could climb into the back seat of the car and go to sleep, and parents could watch the rest of the movie. So that's sort of unintended, right? That's not one of the causes of the fall of the studio system, but it's sort of unintended consequence of all of that. And I was a child of the drive-in era. Here is my drive-in, and in CARO, Michigan, Femme of Michigan. And the story, it's so really perfect. It's just a perfect story. That drive-in screen blew over in a big storm somewhere in the 80s. It blew over a big storm somewhere in the 80s. Drive-ins weren't that big a thing anymore, and so whoever owned the property just, I guess they chopped it up and hauled it to the trash or something like that. And now in that same exact spot is, are you ready? A Walmart. So very perfect, right? A Walmart. I can take my car there, go to Walmart when I go back to visit my mother, turn the car, face the screen, close my eyes, pretend I'm back in high school at the CARO drive-in. And again, lots of B movies. Now today, if you go to the drive-in, you're going to see whatever's playing in all the theaters. But for a while, drive-in movies were sort of cheesy and cheap and whatever. So here at the drive-in, CARO drive-in, look at that, $1 per car load. This must have been toward the end. This wasn't, but you know, God's Little Acre, Tobacco Road, Let No Man Write My Epitaph, Tales of Terror, definitely B movies. So kind of cool. Okay, definitely B movies at the drive-in. Okay, and I think the last, we got a few more things to do here today. Let's see here. McCarthyism and the Red Scare. Communist witch hunts, an overreaction really to post-war communist gains led by Senator Joe McCarthy. Okay, so this is kind of an ugly time in America and kind of an ugly time in Hollywood. A lot of Hollywood writers were sympathetic, you might say, to all this. And Senator Joe McCarthy, seen right here, was a leading proponent of rounding up all of the communists or communist sympathizers. Communism, of course, red, right? The red flag, all that. So sometimes if you're sympathetic, you would be pink or pinko. That was another derogatory term, pinko. So it really did hit. It's a political thing, but it really did hit Hollywood as this overreaction to all this. And so there were blacklisting, and the reason for the blacklisting was it was a secret list. Do not hire this person. And part of the reason for that was that it's not illegal to be a communist. It's not illegal in America. It's not illegal to be a fascist or a white supremacist. None of that stuff's illegal. What's illegal is, to take up arms and try to overthrow the government by violent means. That's what's illegal. Okay, a coup, right, with armies and guns and tanks and all that. But just being a communist or being a fascist or white supremacist or anything is not illegal. Okay, but there was a big fervor that there were communists in the government. There were communists teaching our children, and so on, or so they thought. And very much an overreaction. And so the studio said, well, we can't just fire these people because they will sue us and they will win. It's not illegal to be a communist. And if we just fire them for being a communist, then they'll sue us and they'll win. And so you people in Congress, you senators and congressmen and women in Congress, you need to make it a law. And they said, well, we can't make it a law because that would go against the Constitution. So they couldn't constitutionally do it, but what they did, sort of nefarious and underhanded, was they just said, we don't have any more work for you. We don't have any more work. So there was a blacklist, like a secret list, and all of a sudden these writers, a lot of writers, but actors and actresses, couldn't find work mysteriously. So it really did affect Hollywood. And so there would be loyalty oaths, and really the ugliest part of all is turning in your friends. I mean, it's one thing to say, I was a communist in the 1930s. It was during the Depression. Everybody was out of work. It looked like, there's no rich, there's no poor, we're all the same. And so I went to some meetings, somebody might say, right? Somebody might say. And then the war broke out and I joined up and fought and so on. And now it's 20 years later, right? Now it's 20 years later. Now it's the 50s. And are you now, or have you ever been a member of the Communist Party? People would be asked, have you ever been a member of the Communist Party? And they could say, well, I'm not now, but I was. And then they'd say, who else? Who was at that meeting? And that's where it gets really ugly. Do you really want to turn in your friends? Right? You want to turn in your friends and say, it was at so-and-so's house. And imagine today, right? Imagine today that you get pulled over and they find some alcohol in your car and you're not 21 and somebody says, okay, you're, open container, right? That's against the law, but we'll go easy on you if you tell us who bought that beer for you. So are you going to tell on your friend who bought your 21-year-old friend? Are you going to tell on your friend, turn them in, or not? Okay, and that's where it gets kind of tough, right? If you have a record, maybe it might be hard for finding a job or transferring to other colleges, things like that. On the other hand, right, there are people, your friends, possibly, that you would be turning in. And that's where it gets very, very ugly, right? We all make our own decisions, and people in the late 40s and early 50s were asked to make those kinds of decisions. So there is well, let's move on. There were 10 in particular. They're called the Hollywood 10. They are writers who refused to testify, held in contempt, a short jail time, and then they were blacklisted. And the most famous was Dalton Trumbo. There he is, right there. Bryan Cranston played him in the movie, so I would be showing that trailer called Trumbo right about now. And in the movie, we see how Trumbo went under an assumed name, and others would find a front, someone with a clean name. although not quite as good a writer, likely. It's someone with a clean record, clean name, and here's my script. Put your name on it. Turn it into the studio, and I'll give you, whatever, 5%, something like that. I'll give you some of that if you turn in that script. And so they did, right? So there were fronts, blacklists, all that, and I think these are Trumbo's children. And I don't know who, I'm not sure who they all are. I can't quite tell. But I know that's Dalton Trumbo for sure. And he won a couple of Oscars while he was blacklisted under assumed names. And the Writers Guild has tried to rectify all that over the past half century or so, and putting the correct credits on movies. In one case, I think it's Bridge on the River Kwai, the Oscar went to a man who can't even write in English, right? He's French. And it was based on his book, Pierre Boulez. He also wrote Planet of the Apes, by the way. Anyway, he won the Oscar for Best Screenplay, and he can't even write in English. And so it became kind of a joke, really, assumed writers. And frankly, I think the Hollywood studios were conservative, and they were worried, but I think they were more worried about the public and the perceptions on the public and the perceptions on their business. I think they just, if you're talented, you're talented. I don't really think that they cared about if you were a communist or if you were homosexual or anything like that. And there are lots of instances of closeted gay men and women who really couldn't be outed because of the fear of the public perception. The studios, they knew there were a number of gay directors, and they knew they were gay, and they figured as long as they were in the closet that everything would be fine. But if the public found out, then maybe the public would stop going to see movies directed or written or starring certain people. But my gut feeling is that the studio heads really didn't care. It was more of a business decision than some sort of a moral decision. It's my gut feeling. So right about here, I would show a wonderful documentary on Hollywood aliens and things, and about the Red Scare. And there were a number of wonderful allegorical movies. And you guys know allegory from high school. The Crucible, right, was about witch hunts, right? They called them the communist witch hunts. You probably know about Animal Farm, right? Another allegory about communism. So that's what they were doing in the 1950s. Invasion of the Body Snatchers and Invaders from Mars. I have the link for you. You can watch the trailers and maybe some scenes from both of those movies. They're very cool. Invaders from Mars is in color. It's a very, very cool movie. It frightened the heck out of me because people are pulled down into the sand pit, and we had a big sand pit right behind our house in CARO, Michigan. So it was pretty terrifying for me. But the aliens are going to take over normal people, right? Just like commies are going to take over regular Americans, right? So that's the allegory. You can either see it as a nice sci-fi movie, or you can see that this is sort of the stand-in for normal Americans, because you can't look at somebody and tell if they're communist, right? Just like in these movies, you can't look at the pod people or the people that have been taken over by the aliens and tell that they are that the aliens are the puppet masters and all of that, right? So that's the allegory. If you're a little kid, then okay, it's a scary movie. But if you're an adult, maybe you get the idea of the allegory and communism and all that. So check out those two films. And along the same lines, moving on, we have On the Waterfront by Elia Kazan. Kazan is the name of the director. And he named names. Kazan, named name, not Brando. Kazan, named names. And so in this movie that's set on the waterfront, where the dock workers would be, the longshoremen would be, Marlon Brando, as Terry Malloy, must testify against the mob who rule the waterfront by fear. So here, on the waterfront, the hero will testify, right? The hero will testify. And that's sort of Kazan saying that he testified during the McCarthy communist witch hunts because he's heroic. He's not a rat. He's not ratting out his friends who are communist and naming their names. He is taking a heroic stand. So there's a wonderful scene with Marlon Brando in On the Waterfront with his brother. And the Brando character in the movie, before he starts working on the waterfront, was a boxer, pretty good boxer in the movie, and he was told by the mob to throw some fights so that they could bet against him. Even though he was favored, they could bet against him, they could make some money, but in the meantime, he is throwing fights and not winning them and becoming very disillusioned and dissatisfied, very angry, right? He thought he could have been a contender, as he says in the movie. I could have been a contender. And he has to throw some of these fights. So he is going to meet a pretty young girl and a fiery Catholic priest and start learning a little bit about his conscience and that sort of thing. Okay, so that is Elia, E-L-I-A, Elia Kazan's answer on the waterfront. And Brando is a method actor. Do I have method actor in here? Well, let me just add that in. He was a method actor. Write down M-E-T-H-O-D, a method actor for some reason. Hold on, let me check and see. There we go. Okay, I have it. Okay. I wasn't sure. So in the next, another film, The Wild One from 1953, Brando's character was a nonconformist. Not really a beat or a beatnik, but definitely a nonconformist. And he studied method acting. And I don't know if they were in the same class with James Dean, but over the years, Robert De Niro, Al Pacino, and lots of Marilyn Monroe, lots of actors have studied method acting. And part of it is a more naturalistic way of acting, getting into character. If you are going to be a taxi driver, like De Niro was in Taxi Driver, then go drive a taxi, see what it's like, see what that world is like, and really become that character. Don't just memorize your lines, but become that character. And so Marlon Brando did some work in the theater, on stage. He met Elia Kazan. He learned method acting, made a couple of movies with him, was a nonconformist on stage, in life too. And I have some nice links to some YouTube clips from this film as well. It's really a fun film as a motorcycle rider. And very cagily, the writer, director, producers of the movie don't make the motorcycle gang the bad guys. The bad guys are a rival motorcycle gang who are causing havoc in this small town and destroying things and causing trouble. It's based on a real event that took place in the 1940s in California. A giant motorcycle gang came into a small town, Stockton, I think it is. They still have a big rally in Stockton every year. And since then, maybe they're paying homage or respect or something like that. But there's still a big rally. And if you saw Indiana Jones and the Kingdom of the Crystal Skull, you might remember, Shia LaBeouf's character was dressed like that. And so very definitely the movie was set in the 1950s. The Shia LaBeouf character would have seen this movie, and that's who he's paying homage to. Okay, all the leather and the jeans, and so on, right? Good kids didn't wear jeans, okay? Good kids wore slacks. Jeans were for motorcycle kids or possibly farm kids, but not nice middle-class kids. But by the 1960s, with the hippies and bell-bottom blue jeans and all that good kind of stuff, all that fashion stuff's going to change. So Marlon Brando, and we will see Marlon Brando again when we get to The Godfather, right? When we get to The Godfather, we're going to see Brando as Don Vito Corleone. And sometimes I get to this film on this day, and sometimes I run out of time and have to do it in the next class. But our next film would be Rebel Without a Cause with James Dean, definitely a Hollywood icon. And the movie was in color, and that's partly why they put him in that bright red jacket there. Okay, it's not a leather jacket or anything, but it's a bright red, and that's because it was in color, and it looked pretty good in color. And it was a widescreen movie and all that, even though it was kind of set around teenagers. And so part of what we'd be talking about in the 1950s is conformity, nonconformists. A lot of people said, gee, we've been through this big depression, we've been through a world war, everybody just go along and get along and don't cause trouble, don't rock the boat, right? Just take it easy. It's the 1950s. And a lot of people, like our president, frankly, remember the 1950s as a really wonderful, heady time for America. And we really stood like a colossus over the world. So much of the world had damage and destruction from bombing in Europe and in the Pacific from the war. And aside from Pearl Harbor, we were pretty much left untouched here in the U.S., or the continental U.S. And so the 1950s, in a lot of people's minds, was a really great time to be alive. And yes, it would have been a great time to be alive if you were a white male. Okay, if you were a white male, okay, then yeah, sure. But boy, if you were female, if you were black, African American, Hispanic, not really a great time. Not really a great time. So anytime you hear somebody talking about how wonderful the 50s were and a chunk of the 60s, you kind of have to remember it's probably coming out of the mouth of a white male. Frankly, not really a great time for a lot of other people. The schools were segregated. African Americans were sent to inferior schools in public. There would be separate bathrooms, separate drinking fountains, served in the back, only takeout in restaurants, never for dine-in. They would be sitting in the balcony in movie theaters, all that segregation stuff. I don't want to get too far into it, but that's all from the 1950s and 1960s, and not really a fantastic time. So the next time anybody talks about wonderful 1950s, maybe remember that. In any event, James Dean was definitely an icon. He made just 3 movies. And there we are in Rebel Without a Cause. There is a switchblade fight, right? A spring-loaded blade. They're illegal. I remember you had to go to Tijuana to get a switchblade. And maybe even today. I don't know if they have switchblades in Tijuana today or not. It's been a while since I've been there. But that was kind of the thing, right? You'd have to go to Tijuana to get a switchblade. But gangs, not guns so much in the 50s, but gangs with switchblades and maybe chains and things like that. And so he's forced to be in this fight, the James Dean character. His parents keep moving from school district to school district because he keeps getting in trouble and that sort of thing. And he's having anger issues and this and that and the other. And he does a little bit of acting out. And so this gang guy here challenges him to a switchblade fight at the Griffith Observatory. Very cool place, the Griffith Observatory up in Hollywood. And shockingly, James Dean died in a car accident. He had a Porsche Spider, I believe, September 30th, 1955, I believe it is. He just ran into a tree or a sign or something like that up in Central California. And it really shocked Hollywood and the whole world. He was a big star. He'd only made those 3 movies, East of Eden, Giant, and Rebel Without a Cause, and he was nominated for Oscars and so on. And he was 25 or 26 or 27 years old, something like that, when he died. So James Dean never got old and became an icon. And if you were to go up to Griffith Park today, the observatory, then you will see this bust of James Dean, and you can go and take your picture next to it. Frame it up just like that so you can see the Hollywood sign right back there. And I don't know who this is from online, so I don't know who this young lady is. But you can go up to the Griffith Observatory. It's a planetarium. It's a planetarium, and it's in lots of movies. It's in Men in Black and just tons and tons of movies. And so at some point they put this up, sort of representing all the many Hollywood movies that were shot at the Griffith Observatory. Okay, phew. That's a long day. It seems to me normally I have to do Rebel Without a Cause in the subsequent class because it is kind of a long day and I'm out of breath, but we are done for class 2. This would be the second class, I believe. I think I have that right. All right, let me figure out how to stop this.